Welcome everyone to Bethesda Green's Innovation Lab Summer Speaker Series, tackling environmental challenges through sustainable entrepreneurship. During this series, we will discuss ideas that impact people, the planet, and profits. My name is Patty Simonton, and I'm the director of the GIIN Business Program here at Bethesda Green. Thank you for taking the time to join us today for the first session of our series, Understanding the Role of Sustainability Reporting Frameworks in Impact Investing. I'd like to take just a minute to introduce Bethesda Green and some of the work we do here, which we organize under two primary categories, GIIN Business and GIIN Living. Bethesda Green's GIIN Living program works to elevate community engagement and enhance the quality of life for local residents. Our community projects include efforts to improve stormwater management, promote street-level community recycling, and improve access to green space, energy, and transportation. Our Environmental Leaders program supports environmental education in high school seniors, cultivating the next generation of visionary green leaders. Under our GIIN Business program, we support leaders who are building for-profit business models around innovative and sustainable solutions to tackle environmental and social changes. As part of our BCorp program, we advise existing local businesses through the BCorp certification process and help them discover and implement best practices for sound governance, support for workers, and sustainability. We also welcome mission-aligned idea stage through seed stage companies to our innovation lab and have developed 4 distinct programs to provide relevant and timely support to founders, including our incubator, accelerator, residency, and amplifier programs. Applications are rolling for both our incubator and our amplifier programs, and applications will open shortly for our 2022 Spring Accelerator cohort. Interested founders are strongly encouraged to join our incubator as early as possible to benefit from our year-round programming. We focus on companies developing innovations in the areas of environmental sustainability and sustainable food systems. I invite all founders who are ready to join our exciting and growing community to email me at innovationlab@bethesdagreen.org if you'd like to learn more. And finally, before we jump into today's panel discussion, I'd like to acknowledge our amazing network of partners and sponsors for believing in us and the work that we do. Today, I am pleased to welcome 3 outstanding leaders in their field to share their thoughts with us today. Griffin is the founder and CEO of ImpactableX, where she works with social entrepreneurs and impact funds to define, model, value, and forecast social and environmental impact as a derivative of sales, allowing them to effectively execute on their mission and leverage impact to amplify growth. Prior to launching ImpactableX, Catherine served as managing director at an award-winning impact accelerator, Good Company Ventures, where she built multiple global cross-sector innovation consortiums designed to catalyze and accelerate the application of new technologies to address the world's most pressing challenges. In 2014, she led the execution of Fast Forward, an award-winning partnership between the City of Philadelphia, Bloomberg Philanthropies, and the Wharton Social Impact Initiative, designed to address the city's public safety challenges. Leveraging the success of this work, Catherine then built a partnership with the Obama administration's Climate Data Initiative in 2017, called Climate Ventures 2.0. Catherine serves as a judge for leading pitch competitions nationwide and a preeminent resource on impact measurement and management for accelerators and funds around the world. Darius Nassiry is a change and sustainable finance expert with experience in investment banking, infrastructure finance, international development, clean and renewable energy, and technology innovation and deployment. He is currently a director at Climate Finance Advisors. Darius has previously served as a consultant to the Department of Energy Advanced Research Projects Agency, the energy part of that, a principal with Rocky Mountain Institute, as a research associate with the Overseas Development Institute, and as a visiting fellow with the Center for Global Development. He has also advised the Asian Development Bank, Climate Bonds Initiative, and the German Development Agency on green finance. Darius served as an advisor to the Director General and Head of International Cooperation at the Global Green Growth Institute, and led country teams at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, where he developed investment programs in Asia and launched the agency's Climate Change Initiative. Earlier in his career, he worked as an investment banker for energy and utility sector clients in the US and Europe and Japan. He began his career as a US diplomat in Mexico and Kenya. And if you all think that these two people were busy, we'll just keep going. This is an amazing panel of very talented people. Jennifer Woofter is the founder and president of Strategic Sustainability Consulting, where she has worked with more than 50 clients on projects including green auditing, sustainability planning, carbon footprint analysis, stakeholder engagement, training and facilitation, and sustainability reporting. She currently manages the SSC Consultant Network, which is an association of more than 650 professionals with expertise in virtually every area of sustainability, leading it to become a B Corporation and an EPA Energy Star partner. Jennifer is a member of the International Society of Sustainability Professionals and Net Impact, and speaks regularly on panels, working groups, webinars, and at conferences. Prior to starting SSC, Jennifer worked for Calvert Group, the nation's largest family of socially responsible mutual funds. She worked directly with portfolio managers and oversaw the ethical decision-making process for the $36 million Calvert Social Index Fund. She also spearheaded the firm's transparency and disclosure initiatives, encouraging companies to produce sustainability reports using the Global Reporting Initiative, the GRI. I am so thrilled that all of you could join us today. Thank you for being here. So let's jump in, shall we? I'd like to start with a few questions for each of you, and then we'll open the conversation to questions from our attendees. Everyone is invited to share your questions and comments in the chat, and we'll aim to answer as many as we can. During today's conversation, I'd like to talk about impact investors, how impact investors make decisions and measure the impact of their portfolio. We'll touch on sustainability reporting frameworks and discuss how a company can best communicate its successes to investors and other stakeholders using data-driven metrics. All right, my first question to Jennifer. There are several sustainability reporting frameworks used by impact investors around the globe, and increasingly by companies who feel the growing pressure to report their own impact metrics to stakeholders. Could you please help set the stage a little bit by introducing a couple of the major reporting frameworks and identify some of the major trends you see happening in this industry now?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And what I want to say is that I think a lot of us have been in sustainability for a long time. The last 20 years have been a wild west. It was like every 6 weeks, there was a new platform, a new standard, a new set of metrics. And just in the last couple of years have we started to see some real harmonization. So while there still are a handful of different sustainability reporting standards that are being used, I think what we will see over time is an even further coalescing into a core group of indicators that are applicable to all companies, and then a handful of sector or industry specific add-ons that are the most important given whether you're a mining company or a semiconductor company or an apparel company. So with that, I will say that right now we see the Global Reporting Initiative still continues to be the main framework that corporations are using, and largely because they had the first mover advantage. The first GRI guidelines came out, gosh, more than 20 years ago. They are a multi-stakeholder group so that they are very responsive to not just what investors wanted to see, but also what labor unions wanted to see and what employees wanted to see and what customers wanted to see. And so you do see it being quite broad-based in terms of the types of disclosures that companies are being asked to be transparent on. I think GRI kind of got to where it is and has plateaued a little bit. You don't see the growth in GRI reporting the way that you did 10 years ago. It kind of got to where it was and then it kind of stalled out. And part of that was because it was so comprehensive, it's quite a detailed undertaking. You know, to be asked to disclose, 100+ different things, ranging from policies to programs to performance metrics to goals to engagement types and things like that. It was very big. And so what you saw was companies that were going to do it, but it was increasingly harder to convince more companies to do it. And so there was this question of like, could we do an easier version of this? And one that was more tailored to what the most relevant items were for your industry. And that's really where you saw the rise of the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, or SASB, SASB. That is very much an investor-driven transparency standard. There's 70 versions. They did a sector by sector, industry by industry set, and they said, don't report on 100. Report on 10 or 12 or 8 or 15. Like, what is the core group, the most important ESG issues? And the lens that they used to say most important was, what are the ESG issues or the sustainability issues that are most likely to have a material financial impact on the company? So whereas GRI was much more broadly based, like what was fair, what was reasonable, what was responsible. SASB really says, yeah, but is it going to have a financially material impact on your business? And that really shrank the number of indicators. And so you do see some pretty common ones across companies, things like how much energy do you use? How much of that energy comes from the electricity grid? What is your percentage of renewable energy? That's a pretty common one across all industries, but you also see very, very industry specific ones. For example, if you're a food company, they talk about the Global Food Safety Initiative and what your audit rate is and your non-conformance rate. If you're a mining company, they're going to be asking about mine safety incidents. And this one is very, very tailored. And the idea is that by choosing a smaller group that everybody reports to, you can look at peer groups to see comparative performance. So SASB and GRI are the two big ones. I think we're also starting to see some of the stock exchanges come out with their own guidelines. They largely overlap. We see the Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosure has come up with just a climate focused expectation around reporting on climate governance, strategy, risk, and metrics. And then we're seeing also issue specific and industry specific. So for example, the Sustainable Apparel Coalition has their own standard for measuring and then being transparent about those. So it's a bit of a mix, but we are starting to see this coalescing around the big three issues, which this year, and I would expect in the next few years, are going to be climate is the big one on the environment side, diversity and equity and inclusion is the big one on the social side. And on the governance side right now, which is definitely an emerging issue, is cybersecurity, data security, data privacy. That is from a, where is your governance piece likely to have financial material impact? It is, can you be safe with the data that you hold? So with that, I feel like that was like a big word dump. I'm going to stop here so we can go on to the next question.
Awesome, thank you. And it's so interesting how, what these companies are measuring, like cybersecurity, of course, wasn't a thing, not that long ago. And of course, now it's like, well, we actually need to pay attention to this. Yeah. Question number 2 to Darius. What do you think are some of the factors that have led to the development of a variety of reporting frameworks adopted by impact investors?
Thank you so much. And thank you, Patty, for the opportunity to join this panel. I feel humbled by the expertise that Jennifer and Catherine are bringing. And I'll just give a very brief introduction to myself. At Climate Finance Advisors, we work at the intersection between climate and finance. So much of what I have to say will be colored by that point of view. And to respond to your question, I think there have been a number of factors, particularly in recent years, as Jennifer noted, that have accelerated the development and adoption of reporting frameworks. I think fundamentally, before going into detail about particular frameworks, we have to recognize that there are certain durable factors in the macroeconomy and in the global environment that are driving all of these transformations. One of them, of course, is climate change. This is driven by physics that I think people are increasingly aware of through the weather report. We have fires in the Pacific Northwest that are driving air pollution in New York. We have fires in Siberia that are releasing methane that's been stored in permafrost for eons. And we have torrential rains that were previously well outside the normal distribution of rainfall in places like Germany and Belgium that are bringing to the front of the agenda climate change concerns. In the background, you have biodiversity concerns, the collapse in species in different ecosystems. And as Jennifer highlighted, in other areas of our society, we have now prioritized recognizing the damage that a lack of attention to diversity, equity, and inclusion can have to both economic growth and overall societal performance. Those are not areas of my expertise, so I'll leave those to the side, but underscoring that they are equally important. So underneath the climate drivers for indicators are the physics. And with the recognition that climate is an enduring factor that will shape the global economy for decades to come, I think there has been a priority placed on the questions around what is green and what is good enough performance. I think up until maybe a decade ago, the priority had been focused on pollution and how do you clean up the mess you make. Now I think people are beginning to recognize that not only are companies and individuals attuned to carbon emissions, but also what the impacts of climate change could have on their businesses. And that's where we've seen indicator frameworks emerge around physical impacts, as well as the policymakers' response to this kind of emergency, which we categorize as transition risks alongside the physical risks. So with the recognition that this is a priority for the economy, indicator frameworks have emerged to answer this question, what is green and what is good enough performance? I think aligned with the DEI agenda and the cyber agenda to some extent is the recognition that both society and technology are changing at the same time as we're experiencing the early stages of climate change. So with the recognition of DEI issues and technology issues writ broadly, we have a much richer agenda of concern by investors and other stakeholders around what corporate performance is expected to be going forward. And that's why I think this webinar is so useful, particularly for the startups in your network at Bethesda GIIN, because as we look forward, I think we're going to be outside of the space of the luxurious space which we had before, where impact investors were the ones primarily concerned with these issues. I think we're moving to a space and an era when it would be too much to say everyone's an impact investor, but the issues that have primarily concerned impact investors before are now on the mainstream agenda for investors. And that means that big asset managers like BlackRock garner attention when Larry Fink comes out and says, we're going to start paying attention to climate change, and starts voting his shares accordingly to prioritize board members, for example, that are attuned to these issues. And I think for the startup space, the point I would like to leave the attendees to this webinar, and I'd love to hear Jennifer and Catherine's opinions, particularly if you agree with me, is I think we're moving to a space where even startups have to start thinking about their sustainability plan. They may not have to comply with SASB or GRI as they're setting up their first bank accounts, but I think they need to have a vision that their startup, be it a goods or services company or some other platform they're setting up, has to be aware that they're operating in a new era. And this era takes in, they will be forced as owners to take into account these considerations, and to the extent possible, mainstream their customers and investors' concerns around sustainability, inclusion, and other risks. And that's why these reporting frameworks have come up. That's why they're beginning to harmonize, because investors demand that. But that's why you're also seeing this proliferation, because it is a complicated field, and a company in sector A and a company in sector B may be quite different. And I think as we get into the science and the details of how these companies and business actually operate in the real world, that's when you get the complexity of understanding how they're impacting the environment, how the environment might impact them. I'll stop there and welcome further questions. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. And we'll definitely get back to that topic of, what counts as good enough, for sure. Catherine, ImpactableX seeks to work with companies to identify their custom metrics and then align with some of the major reporting frameworks that exist. Can you tell us a little bit more about your approach to impact measurement and modeling that can help companies focus on the metrics that matter most to them and their investors and stakeholders?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Patty, for having me, and Darius and Jennifer. I'm delighted to be on the stage with you. I'm humbled as well by your experience. We come at this problem from a little bit of a different angle. So we serve primarily early stage social entrepreneurs. And I just want to call out some fundamental foundational differences. Many of the companies we're working with are driving impact through sales of products and services. So the products and services they've developed in and of themselves solve global and environmental challenges. So we're looking less at operationally driven impact, like board composition or hiring practices, or the pay gap between the lowest paid employee and the CEO. We're looking more at what a product or service can do to affect change in the world. And so as a result, we're evaluating the relationship between revenue and revenue growth and impact creation. And here we're seeing social and environmental issues less as risk, but actually as market opportunities. And so if a company can solve these major problems, they can actually create value. And by capturing that value, they can really unlock quite a bit of growth. So we look at it a little bit differently, and we've developed our modeling methodology for early stage entrepreneurs to establish and build upon as they grow. And I'm happy to tell you a bit more about how we do that, but the frameworks that we are looking at from an early stage perspective are a little bit different. So we're certainly looking at the Sustainable Development Goals at a very high level, their targets and indicators. At a mid-level, then we're looking at the IMP, the Impact Management Project's 5 dimensions of impact, which says when you're measuring impact, you want to be looking at the who, the what, the how much, the contribution, and the risk. And here we're not talking about risk exposure from environmental degradation or social upheaval. We're looking at risk that impact may not actually be delivered. And then the third framework we align with is the IRIS Plus core metric set or taxonomy, which basically says if we're talking about a household, this is what we mean. And if you're talking about energy efficiency, let's all be talking about the same thing. And so those are the frameworks that we really align with at an early stage. But when we work first with companies, we get a sense of their innovation, we get a sense of a use case, their technology, and their business model. And we work with them to define the metrics that are most meaningful and measurable for them in their work first. Many times those are not custom metrics. Many times those very much do align directly with the global standards, but sometimes they don't. And so we don't want to see founders really get pulled off the mark in an effort to align with standards if the metrics that are most applicable for them are not a perfect alignment. And I'm happy to tell you much more about our methodology from there. But just really wanted to set the stage in terms of the perspective that we take on this. In terms of what impact investors are looking for, as has been mentioned before, there has been quite a bit of fragmentation in the space because no one is saying, this is exactly how to do it. And many impact funds have been around for a while. They've developed their own proprietary frameworks. They have metrics that they track. They have reporting requirements. I think the other sort of component of this is stage of development. So are we talking about seed stage investors, or are we talking about much more institutional or growth stage investors? And I think the level of sophistication varies among them, and the level of expectation also, varies accordingly, which I think is appropriate. And what I can say is, according to research released by the GIIN, the Global Impact Investing Initiative Network, 100% of impact investors prioritize impact measurement and management. So impact investors will ask you as a founder how you plan to measure your impact. They may not tell you exactly what they expect to see or how to go about measuring it. They may not really sort of upfront, share what they want you to say, but they'll ask you about it. And so having a rigorous response to that is an opportunity to differentiate yourself as a company, I think. And signal to investors who are keen on recognizing additional opportunities for monetization, the value that you can unlock by solving these global problems. So it's an opportunity to preempt some of these questions, differentiate yourself, and then, inevitably, especially if you're engaging impact investors, you'll need to track and report on impact over time. So let me stop there.
Great, thank you. With services like ImpactableX and being able to kind of work with outside consultants like that, a lot of very, very early stage companies don't necessarily have the means to do that. And so I'm interested in kind of hearing, and Jennifer, I'll throw this to you for now, but because measuring impact can be viewed really as time consuming and expensive, and some of these early companies just can't do that, what suggestions do you have for how founders might try and suss out the metrics that do matter specifically to them, most of their business models and their growth strategies as they move forward?
Yeah, so I think my first recommendation is go to the SASB website and download your industry standard. If you are in food, if you are in apparel, if you are in tech, right, there is a standard that is out there. It is free to download. Those reports run about 30 pages, and they really focus on, there's sort of a table of metrics that they have identified as the most important for your industry. And then the rest of the report is the justification for why. They're pulling in examples from other companies. They're looking at trend information. It is a really good sort of one-stop shop to say, from an investor perspective, what are the metrics that are the most likely to have that financially material impact. The second tip I have is, and this sort of speaks to Catherine's point, is look at both the risk that you have of mismanaging sustainability issues, but also look at the opportunity. What is the problem you are trying to solve, and where can effective management of your operations, of your product development cycle, of the suppliers that you choose, where can you be getting competitive advantage in your industry and in your geography and in your particular supply chain? And it may not just be within your industry. You may be playing in a specific niche that no one else is. You may be geographically proximate to an amazing university doing amazing research that you can get that no one else can get. There are so many opportunities, and I think part of it is just really taking that big picture view and then diving in. Like, what is unique about your business that would put a special spin on what the industry says you should be looking at? And the last thing I would say is that, and this is like just a little bit of tough love, because I work with a lot of big companies, and then I also work with a lot of like early stage, right? Where it's like a founder who maybe is even still working a full-time job, right? It's like hustling on the side to get this going. And especially when I'm talking to people like at Bethesda GIIN, or as part of the Mentor Capital Network, or these social impact investing, founders come to the table with like a really personal take on sustainability. There is like, they have a story, they have a moment. I was hiking in the woods and I saw a koala bear and I realized Earth is precious, right? Everyone comes like with this very, very personal thing. But what I want to say to you, my tough love, is that your personal story and your personal connection to sustainability impact may not be where your business needs to be focused. There needs to be some discipline in being able to step back and say, yes, I have my personal take, but from a business perspective, where are the sustainability risks and opportunities? And I think that sometimes that can be a stumbling block, where you say, no, but it's forests. And actually, no, it's oceans, or it's conflict minerals, or it's something else, it's plastics, it's be willing to take that broader view of sustainability and maximize your business impact. It's beautiful if it connects to your personal story and your personal interest in sustainability, but frequently it will not. And you can really go down sort of a, go down a path that can diminish your ultimate impact if you're not careful about really taking that step back and making sure that you are looking at it through a business lens, not just from your personal story.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I mean, hearing from, founders and trying to kind of guide them on that right path, it can be interesting for, I think for early stage founders in particular, to sort of recognize when the story that they're telling resonates differently with the people that they're telling it to, and just acknowledging that, and not being so trapped in the view that they have. Yeah, no, definitely. Darius, you mentioned earlier the idea of good enough. And, I think we talked earlier about the idea of moving goalposts in general in terms of 10 years ago, what companies were willing to do, and kind of under the, label of yeah, being sustainable. Yeah, I'm doing the right thing. It was okay. People could kind of get away with it and not really mind all that much. But what would you say to a company that doesn't really yet measure its sustainability at all or social impact, and to the founders who do believe legitimately that the work that they're doing is good enough?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. And I'm sure that Catherine and Jennifer would be well placed to advise on the frameworks and approaches that would be suitable in that case. But I would say for the first conversation, building on what Jennifer said, I think it's fantastic that startup entrepreneurs have a personal anchor, a narrative that motivates them to be focused on these issues. And I agree, it's not enough to stop there, because the first thing I would say entrepreneurs need to do in general, and in facing sustainability questions in particular, is listen. Listen to your customers, listen to your investors. People are polite about this issue because it's complicated and technical sometimes, and often folks are tentative about wading into the details because it's easy to get stuff wrong if you're not an expert. And I think that means that paying attention to as many different points of view as possible to attune your ear and your business model to the future is a sine qua non requirement for long-term sustainability. Listen to younger people. They're your future customers. Listen to your kids. And if your kids don't approve of what you're doing, you're probably off track before you started filing a report. The second thing I'd say is plan to invest in this. This is not a set of issues that's going to go away or is marginal to your business, regardless of what you're doing. Everyone who's working in the 2021 economy is going to be confronting sustainability questions at some point in their business activities, whether it's in their core operations or in their strategic objectives. As Catherine said, there may be businesses that are built entirely around sustainability, and there are others that are exposed to sustainability questions because of their supply chain or how they're operating. And there may be others that are not drawing up conflict minerals or questionable wood supply, or even aligned with sustainability objectives as their core strategic goal, but they're exposed to physical risks or policy changes or changing consumer behaviors that leave them vulnerable from a longer term perspective to changing tastes. No one wants to be the Blockbuster of their industry. Blockbuster Video, for those of you who remember that. But we're in a dynamic space, and not just because people are trying to wrap their head around the physics and the quantification of these metrics, but because the economy itself is changing expectations about what is good enough. It was true before in the, say, 80s or 90s that people were primarily concerned about what's coming out of the tailpipe of any company. Then people gradually got concerned with the broader sustainability profile of the company. Now people are going to be, I think, moving to a space where we're looking for something more like what Catherine's describing, where companies are expected to have a positive impact just by opening their doors. if you're not reducing carbon, you're causing more pollution in the atmosphere and increasing the risk of climate change. That's an issue for airlines now. People are going to start thinking about, do they need to offset their air tickets, or even more, are they going to fly at all? In Sweden, where I lived before Washington, there's even a word called flight shame. That means you should be embarrassed about getting on an airplane. And post-COVID, I think that's becoming maybe another consideration in people's minds. Do I really need to take that flight? And I think that logic of, do I really need this additional thing in my life, is going to begin to pervade the next generation of consumers thinking, partly because they're going to be probably on average poorer than their parents were. That's just a demographic and economic new reality. But also because there's social reinforcements to behaving well in public. That's why people like to buy green cars. It is virtue signaling, but it's also a deeper behavioral shift that means that people are going to be much more conscious of, does their salad come in a recyclable package? Is their bag something they need to have, or can they bring their own? It starts with plastic straws, but it goes much deeper than that. And what I mean to emphasize here is that as founders begin to operate their businesses, they need to start thinking about sustainability and investing in their own knowledge, and be open to shifting their business models, or let's say tweaking them, to make sure that they're compatible with a future where these concerns are much more primary in their customers' minds. And the last thing I'll say is something that's perhaps obvious to folks on the webinar, that is connect. Connect with others in your industry, connect with others facing the same challenges. This is now the post-COVID opportunity, is to connect globally on platforms like this, where we now have a facility to collaborate, facilitate exchange of information, learn best practices. No one's isolated anymore. We may be working from home some of the time, but we can connect with people facing the same challenge in other countries, across industries, and even with some of these standards boards who might have been sort of remote. They want to improve their work. So listen, invest, and connect would be my 3 suggestions for folks starting out in their sustainability journey, and recognize that this is a new economy. Sustainability is going to be a primary concern for impact investors, but for mainstream investors. And it's never too early to bring these agenda to your team. I would say one last thing, and that is, as founders begin to prioritize sustainability concerns, their employees will appreciate this. Everyone I work with cares about these issues. Many of them are younger than me, but the fact is this next generation is not holding their predecessors in high regard. And I think as employees, as consumers, this is an all-in issue, and you get higher employee retention, you get higher recruitment success, and you get higher engagement when sustainability becomes a priority. Thanks, Patty.
Yeah, no, awesome. Thank you. And, you know, I had a conversation with a founder a few years back. You know, we try to educate our founders through the accelerator about, you know, how to really communicate with impact investors and how to tell their story effectively. And, you know, the founder sort of said, you know, do I really need to be able to do this? Do I need to be able to do that? And do I need to be able to tell these metrics or measure this, or doesn't matter? I just, you know, traditional investors, they don't care. And, you know, really what I'm hearing from you and the others really is that they increasingly they do, you know, and especially if you're working, if the work that you're doing is trying to have any kind of impact, aligning and picking the investors that you do work with, aligning with your mission is an important step to take for all kinds of reasons. And that can dive into a whole other conversation. There is a question in the chat that asks about B Corp. And Catherine, I want to throw this question to you. What role do you think that green business certifications such as B Corp or green business or fair trade certifications and others play for companies that are seeking to tell their story to impact investors and to other stakeholders? And for those listening, I do also want to just clarify, we will be diving into detail about B Corp and some of these other green business certifications in a following speaker series session. So I'll put that link in the chat here. So this may be more of a high level, but Catherine, I'm interested in your take.
Yeah, sure. And I know the B Corp guys well. I'm based in Philly. They were founded here. So I've been, you know, tracking their story from the very start. And, you know, I'm on calls with folks globally and just delighted to see the level of proliferation the B certification mark has gained worldwide. I think what's important here is to consider how your business is driving impact. B certification looks at operational footprint. So if you're a small or medium-sized business and your impact is primarily driven through operational decision-making, procurement policies, hiring practices, you know, internal decisions that you've put in place, you should be B certified. And I think that that is a signal to investors that this is something you care about. I think it's now become mainstream enough that, you know, consumers also recognize it. It means something to folks. So, you know, worth the investment of time and resources to pursue, if that is what your business is doing. If your business is driving impact through sales of products and services, I think it has more limited applicability. And so, you know, then you might consider life cycle analysis, though that is a very expensive and time-consuming undertaking. You know, that kind of impact measurement and modeling is exactly where we fit in. So I think the question is really what's most meaningful and applicable to you and your business. I would like to respond, and I'm sure Jennifer has a comment here. So let me hand it off to you, Jennifer, by all means.
So my company, my sustainability consulting company became a B Corp back in 2011. Early on. And I will tell you, we're no longer B Corps. Like, I think it's great. We didn't have to do anything in order to hit certification, like just by having a recycling can, and we tried to not use a lot of printing paper. It was not difficult for us to get to. I admire what they're doing, but I will tell you, as a small business owner, I am constantly looking at bang for the buck. Being B Corp certified never got me a single client. A single client never proactively asked me about it. So, I see you're B certified. And now as we are working with clients, they are not being asked about it. And when they try to sell it, they're not getting a lot of bump. So if you are trying to sell your product in a Target or a Walmart or any of the big retailers, they're not gonna not like that you're B Corp, but that's not gonna be what gets you the account. And I think sort of what Catherine is saying is you have to look at what do your stakeholders want, right? You do what your main investor wants, you do, right? It doesn't matter if it aligns with, right? Like, part of this is you have to figure out what are you going for and what do they want as a result of that. And I think that I think B Corp's fine. I think it is driven by a lot of really passionate founders who want to do the right thing. But I don't think B Corp has done a really good job of transitioning over into how do we solve the world's biggest problems, right? Like how it's SASB is looking at from an investor perspective, like what are the most financially material issues? Task Force on Climate Change, climate-related financial decisions is looking at what are the governance mechanisms necessary to get to net zero emissions that every company needs to do. Science-Based Target Initiative, SBTI, is looking at what's the methodology for figuring out what a company's fair share of carbon looks like. Those all go far beyond having a policy that says we care about the environment or having a safety program. Like, all of those are important things, and I do not want to diminish them at all. But I think when we look at the scope of the challenge, the scope of the sustainability challenges ahead of us, and the tools that we're going to need to use, I think it is incumbent upon small businesses and especially entrepreneurs, for which time is our most valuable asset. Every single hour you spend needs to be paying off. And I think whether it's fair trade certification or green biz certification or B Corp, I feel like I've picked on B Corp, but it's not that. It's any of these certifications, any of these third-party approval stamps. You need to be able to make the business case, because for too long sustainability was sort of in that same field as philanthropy. It was like a thing that good founders did or good businesses did, and this is not about being good. This is about surviving, surviving as a company in this new decarbonized economy, but also surviving as people in a climate altered environment. And I think that if you can't make that business case, a really tight business case, then you should move on to something else that does.
I would just add to that, though, that increasingly investors are concerned about impact washing. This is actually the top concern among impact investors, again, according to the GIIN. And so, you know, I couldn't agree more with what Jennifer just shared. You know, we are primarily working with a different type of business, but I have spoken with quite a few business owners that have B certification, and it's sort of like you check the box. It doesn't necessarily unlock new opportunities for you. But if you are reporting out on impact, if you are making impact claims, you should be able to substantiate them. And if you can't substantiate them with primary data, you should have very clear assumptions outlined and be able to substantiate those assumptions and have plans to then validate and refine those assumptions over time. So we work with early stage companies. Collecting primary impact data is a challenge. Lots of companies don't know what to measure or how. And so the first step is to define your metrics and begin to make some initial assumptions that are informed by third-party research and comps, and then put measures in place to get smarter. So I just want to really underscore the point that third-party review and verification of any claims you're making is becoming an increasingly important and salient concern among impact investors. And now sort of impact assurance is becoming a new industry that's emerging as well. We see groups like Tideline's new Blue Mark, which is really reviewing impact investors' measurement and management practices and verifying them to really ensure that the social impact movement writ large maintains its legitimacy and credibility and doesn't just sort of make investors sleep well at night, you know? So I would say yes, and around third-party certification.
I find this conversation really interesting, and you know, a little bit about the validation component of that, you know, and the role, because you know, again, one of the upcoming conversation on the green business certifications, you know, one of the questions that we're discussing is kind of like, well, what do businesses do if they're not certified, or how can consumers even know what, you know, our company is just sort of BSing us when they put things on their labels that this is, you know, this is what they're doing as a company. And it's like, sure, you know, and you pick it up, you look at it, you're like, what, I can trust them. I don't even know what this label means, but maybe. And so education around that. So I guess if, you know, if on one end, the companies are being held accountable by their investors, you know, and kind of being forced to validate the elements of their business models and to ensure that, you know, everything is on the up and up straight through, that, you know, they have the ability to maybe press them a little harder to actually do the right thing. And consumers are probably going to buy that soap anyway, you know, whether or not they know where it's coming from, right? So it's interesting to think about that. I do want to make sure that I'm hitting some of the questions that are coming through as we go. Well, I guess I kind of want to finish a question that I had also before as well. So this goes to all of you. As some companies work to become more transparent about their business practices, still others will actually work to bury information, right? You know, not all of them are good, socially impactful companies. What are some of the risks companies face when they choose not to report. And, you know, Darius, what you were saying earlier is that increasingly it's not even a choice not to report. I mean, increasingly you pretty much have to, but what are the risks? How can companies actually harm themselves by hiding information?
I'll give it a shot, and then I'll
Sure.
turn it over to Catherine and Jennifer to share their views. In the fossil fuel industry, there's a phrase that's sometimes used called the social license to operate. This is particularly in the context of the divestment movement, where universities and other investors have departed from their fossil fuel investments, partly on the logic of withdrawing the social license for these industries to operate in society. And it's a soft concept that essentially refers to how acceptable that company's existence and operations are to the broader society and economy in which they operate. And this goes back to the discussion around B Corp, because in some sense, B Corp is a signal of a minimum requirement of good behavior. It's not something that everybody recognizes, but for those who do recognize it, it's seen as like a good enough starting point, at least at the time when the company or organization was certified. Climate Finance Advisors itself is a B Corp. So, and I think we're proud of that. I think I agree with Jennifer. It's not clear that that wins sales, but it's part of a broader brand identity that's built around a woman-owned organization that's B Corp certified, and is signaling its intention, our intention to address the world's problems in a serious way and maintain our social license to operate. So when we think about being transparent, I think we're in an era where transparency is no longer something that's fully under the control of the corporate reporting entity. If you have a kid with a cell phone, you've got a reporting entity who's looking at your business in a different way. From a social behavior standpoint, there's a lot more transparency thanks to handheld mobile devices than we had before. Satellite data is now becoming a common means by which investors and other actors can keep an eye on assets and landscapes that are of interest to them. There are companies that are emerging that sell satellite data of forests in Africa or Southeast Asia to trace the behavior of wood providers across their supply chain. And there are movements to invest in asset level data that will increase the level of transparency through the supply chain for corporate entities. So we can envision a day where we would transcend quarterly reporting cycles like the TCFD might support and go to something that's much more hyperactive, frequent, and granular. In the future, I think we can foresee a rhythm of transparency that forces a level of exposure by corporate actors that they're not familiar with, and our systems are not well designed to accommodate. That's why I think it feels like a shock when we discover something is going on in the world that is contrary to our values or goals as a society. And when someone exposes that with a cell phone or satellite data, that's a problem for the actor who would be otherwise expected to behave differently. One example that's outside the corporate space, but illustrates the point. In Western China, the treatment of the Uyghur population was exposed through satellite data. The folks who exposed that satellite, who provide that satellite data, worked on early stage forest mapping of forest fires in Indonesia. And they used the data and were able to compare images and see what was really going on. Investors might not be ready for that world, but that's the world we're moving into. And I think it creates a multi-layered challenge for corporations, for investors, and for other stakeholders, where the transparency, which was previously provided through kind of lumpy periodic reporting, is now being provided on a much more frequent and less voluntary basis. So I think it's, and not to mention that the internet remembers everything. I can't tell you how many times I've seen videos of what a major fossil fuel company might have known 20 or 30 years ago and forgot that they had a video of that, and now it's out there. So we have to pay attention to what's being put out there, but I think we also have to pay attention to, you can't really hide anything anymore. So the best response to this new era of radical transparency is better behavior and recognition that you're everyone's living in a glass house now.
So I'd love to piggyback on that, because I think that there's two really important things to sort of frame out here. The first one is that transparency, like if you go back to the original Global Reporting Initiative, and they said, what are the principles of sustainability reporting? Like the first one is that it needs to be fair and balanced, and we are still not there. If you look at the impact story that companies of all shapes and sizes are telling, it is still 99% rah, rah, look at how we're solving the world's problems, or rah, rah, look at us reducing our carbon footprint, or rah, rah, look, we've hired someone to work on diversity. And it is not really a true and honest accounting of where we are. And I think, on the one hand, we have these stakeholders, as Darius explained so beautifully, right? They're out there catching us, right? They're out there catching us at every turn, and companies are trying to balance that by putting tons and tons of the good stuff out there. Whereas I think that sometimes a too perfect story is suspicious. If we look at the companies that have the real credibility on sustainability, it is those that show their vulnerability. I think you see, like on the big side, you see Unilever really coming out there and talking about, like, here's where we're falling short, or here's where we are really struggling to get our arms around this really thorny problem that we don't have the technology yet, or the supply chain is just too complicated, or we don't have insight into who's doing what. But on the smaller side, and this is still big compared, for one-person entrepreneurs, but like Allbirds just a couple of weeks ago sent an email out to all of their customers that said, look, we have a great sustainability story, but let me tell you, we still have a carbon footprint, right? Here's the places where we have not figured out how to solve this problem. And I can't tell you the number of people who, friends I have not talked to in years, were like, Jennifer, did you see this email from Allbirds? Like, what a breath of fresh air. And that made me really believe in them more. I actually went out and bought another pair of their shoes. Like, I think that there is something about that vulnerability, right? Is that we want to emotionally connect to the brands that we love. And just telling the positive story, number one, people are smart enough to know that's not the full story. But really making it feel like we're on a journey and we want to bring you along with us, I think can be a really powerful narrative, and especially for small businesses who don't have the resources to do it all right now, that can be really powerful. The second piece I wanted to talk about is this idea of carpet bombing information. The trend has been more disclosure, more transparency. You know what? A 20-page sustainability report's not enough. Let's do 150 pages, right? Like, it just gets more and more and more and more. And what we're hearing from stakeholders, particularly investors, but stakeholders across the board, is when you put out so much information, you make it impossible for me to figure out what matters. Like, if you put out 800 spreadsheets, how do I know what are the ones that make the most sense? I want you, the company, to do that work for me. So there is a balance of being transparent about your information, but also presenting it and prioritizing it in a way that allows your stakeholders, whether that's your investors, whether that's your employees, whether it's your customers, to really understand what is the most important. And this is where I think there's a huge opportunity for really small businesses. Don't go for the 75 BCorp questions or the 100 GRI questions. Maybe don't even go for all 15 SASB questions. Pick a couple, pick 3 areas of the business where you think it matters, where you have some control or influence, and where you are excited. Like, that's the nexus. Pick those things and build your sustainability story around that. Being honest and accountable and vulnerable about, yeah, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that we just haven't gotten to yet, but this is where we think we can make a difference. And that, I think, for companies thinking about scaling up, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Get those numbers in. Talk to Catherine, figure out what's the primary data we need to be tracking. What's the format we need to be tracking in? How frequently should we be reporting on it? Picking a few key ones now is going to make telling that story 1,000 times easier and more effective over time. So Yeah, I will let Catherine chime in too, but I think that this idea of vulnerability, transparency doesn't just mean telling more good information. And also this idea of focus, help people understand what is most important. Not saying that other stuff isn't valuable or part of the sustainability picture, but really lead the narrative, frame it the way you want to tell that story.
Yeah, I would agree, Patty, if I can just add on to that. Especially at an early stage, I encourage focus always. I mean, it's important from a business standpoint, be really clear what problem you're solving and how your innovation solves it. But from an impact standpoint, we're talking 3-4 metrics max. Don't go through SASB or IRIS Plus and pick out anything that might be even peripherally aligned. I see this happen with a lot of entrepreneurs because I think they tend to be rock stars and really good students and like want to make sure they get everything. And I get that. And I totally understand. I would encourage focus though. I think investors do not expect you to be saving the world. And if you claim that you will, you'll get a pat on the back. You really want to be able to make a compelling, analytically rigorous presentation of the impact metrics that your company will be tracking, and to what degree you can drive those metrics forward. To the extent that you can contextualize them, that's even better. So we'll abate a ton of carbon over the next year or whatever. Is that a lot or a little for your industry? So providing some context both on the industry and I think on the problem itself, and to what degree, over the growth of your business, you can actually affect change on the problem you're solving. But focus on 1 to 3 impact metrics.
And to kind of build on those comments, then what I'm hearing, and Scott, I'm addressing one of your early questions from this session in terms of, how do small and medium businesses approach, or how should they approach sustainability? Well, I think we've heard some solutions to that over the course of the conversation, but I'm interested in all of your thoughts in terms of what are the ways to communicate this to stakeholders? I mean, is it pictures on social media? We know it's not a 150-page sustainability report, that's too much, but any suggestions in terms of, what is transparency? I mean, I get so many emails from so many companies and I'm on everybody's, email list, and they may tell me about their awesome supply chain, but I'm probably not going to see it because at some point I'm like, can't read another one from this. How do you recommend that they get through the noise?
Yeah, I'll start. I think that having a dashboard, I think it's really important to ground your information with data. Don't make wild claims that back up your data. I can't emphasize, I think if there's one takeaway, it is what Catherine said earlier, that if you make a claim, you better back it up. You don't necessarily need to be splashing all of your assumptions and estimates out there on your website, but have them ready if that question comes up. What you do need though is what's that Excel spreadsheet chart of the 5 lines in the 3 years or the quarters, or show me how the data is changing over time. So have that, put it on your website, update it however frequently you decide it needs to be updated, but not just when it's convenient for you, because quite frankly, it's never convenient. What I will say is that have that there as a landing place that people can always go and see where your latest data is. Maybe scaffold it with a case study or a policy or some narrative around it. But I will say the place where increasingly cutting through the noise is the email or the letter from the CEO. It's Larry Fink, right? CEO of Blackwater, the world's largest asset manager. Everybody reads his annual letter to CEOs. Everybody reads that Allbirds email that they sent out that was the letter from their president saying, look, we do a lot on sustainability, but we have not solved the problem yet, and here's why. That personal message from the top, from the leader who takes that information and contextualizes it, who says, here's why that number matters, or here's why that number doesn't matter, or what does COVID have to do with the way these numbers look this year? What does our next stage of growth mean for how these numbers might change? That's the piece that I think really is often missing. And I think that's the part where people, again, number one, feel the emotional connection, right? Like, wow, the CEO is talking to me, Jennifer, right? Like telling me things I want to know. But I think also it's you expect your leader, your founder, your president, your CEO, it is their job to understand how sustainability fits in with the business model, how it shapes business risk, how it opens new opportunities. And if my CEO is actively engaged in that, including it in the employee town hall, including it in your annual letter out to all customers, in your standard investor presentation, that's, I think, that top level governance that really makes us see, is it integrated into the business strategy?
Okay, fine, I'll start reading more emails.
Well, no, I think these are all excellent points. And I think the theme that I draw from the prior two comments is that this is not, we're no longer in the domain of compliance. We're now in the domain of performance. And in order for brands and startups and companies to perform, we have to shift to an all-in mindset where sustainability is not something for a specialist unit to deal with, but rather for the leadership to focus on. I want to just come back to the transparency question just briefly and just say that I think in this new economy, this new decarbonizing economy, there's much less tolerance for hypocrisy. And although the leader communicates with a letter or an email, and although we see filings that might comply with one or another reporting framework, we also expect the companies to behave every day in a way that's consistent with their stated values. And that means that everything from like the cutlery in a food store to the bags you take your stuff home in have to be consistent with the broader corporate values. I was in a apparel store yesterday and I noticed that what used to be sort of famous synthetic bags have now been replaced by paper bags. And I don't think it was because they ran out of synthetic bags. I think they made a corporate choice that their brand identity is going to be more closely tied to whether you can recycle their packaging than whether you can advertise their brand. And that becomes a signal, in a way, a form of reporting that they're going to do every day. Second point I just want to touch on is that I think it's important that startups, going concerns, express through their behavior that they care about what their customers and the stakeholders care about. And that's where the listening comes in, and that's where all these reporting frameworks derive from, a place of concern around a common set of priorities. So and that's why it's so important for founders to listen and pay attention to what their investors and stakeholders are asking them to focus on. And the last point is something I've touched on before. I'll just emphasize it again, and that is, this is a dynamic space. The physics of climate change is changing. The social and economic expectations of our societies are changing. And what is possible is changing. And that's why we see this proliferation of new standards reflecting these new expectations, and why we should expect them to change over time as this next generation of consumers and voters and stakeholders grow up and become adults, and their expectations will be reflected in these new business models. So this is an intentionally dynamic space that we have to build adjustment into the business model. It's not enough to rest on your laurels of last year's report. It's a changing goalpost, because the goals themselves have become clearer to people, and the expectations that we can reach them are now there. The next generation has been told and believes that nothing is impossible, and everything in their life has affirmed that. Never before have we seen people waiting a year because they know what comes next is going to be better. And that's true for environmental and social and other risk management performance. So being able to adjust and building that adjustment, that change mentality into the business models for the next generation is, I think, an important feature.
Thank you. We've got a couple of questions I'm looking for very short answers on. 30 seconds, one of you have thoughts in terms of like, how should companies decide which reporting framework to use? Where do they start? This can go to anyone who wants to jump in.
I'll jump in. I think look at SASB just for a bit of context, but then really dive in. What is the story? What is the problem you're trying to solve? Look at it both from your products and services, like what are you putting out there in the world, and also the way that you operate. Again, I'm looking for that nexus of what are the issues that matter most? Where do you have control or influence? And the third is what gets you excited. If you can find a couple of things that hit all three of those, that's where you should start. As a small company, as a founder at the beginning, you don't need to completely align with one of these frameworks. Go smaller and nail it. Do an excellent job at a few things. You can add them over time. Excellent.
Thank you. Does anyone want to share your view on offsets and the trend to carbon neutrality briefly?
I'll just jump in. I think carbon offsets are an issue of last resort. The world only has capacity to offset roughly 10 to 12% of the emissions that we're putting out there in the world. You need, assuming everybody got the same amount of offsets, you need to reduce your carbon emissions by 90% through actions and optimization of your value chain. The offsets are at the very, very, very end, and they need to be reserved for the things that absolutely cannot be reduced on their own. It's a huge mistake to create a net zero roadmap that relies heavily on offsets. It's not fair, it's not scientifically based, and it's not going to work.
All right, I dare the other two to argue with that. I will kind of jump in now. The third question, just again, aware of time. Catherine, any quick views, or do you want me to connect you with Scott directly on using the UC Berkeley's cool climate methodology for measuring impact?
Yeah, sure. And Scott, I'd be happy to connect directly. I would probably defer to Darius and Jennifer on this. I mean, there are a number of calculators out there. I know the EPA does some work around conversions as well. And I believe UC Berkeley's methodology is really around that, like transportation and procurement, and sort of translating that into an environmental footprint. And so these are calculators out there. I think it's good for baseline estimates, but I'll defer to them because they're really experts in the climate space.
Awesome. All right. On the topic, this is your final question. We're going to wrap up with all of this. On the topic of sustainability reporting, what's one piece of advice that you think all founders should hear, especially those preparing to scale their business in the next 2 to 3 years?
Start collecting data.
Awesome.
Yeah, and document your estimates and your assumptions and where the data comes from. You think you're going to remember it, but you are not.
Pay attention to the space. It's changing and important and will continue to become an increasingly high priority for every business in the economy. It's no longer a specialist niche anymore. It's an all of economy concern, and Bethesda GIIN has done a great service for its members to bring Jennifer and Catherine's expertise and allow me to participate in this panel. So thank you very much.
Darius, Jennifer, Catherine, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your afternoon with us today. It's really just been wonderful to chat with you. And I have no doubt that I'm going to be getting some comments from some of the attendees here going like, hey, can I chat with so-and-so? So you may hear from me on that, on that as well. For everyone attending, we will be posting this session live on our website, or the recording of it, of course, on our website. As well as a summary blog that our amazing impact intern, Caroline Davenport, is going to be writing up for us on here. So all of the information shared, the resources, the organizations mentioned, we'll have a comprehensive list of all of that pulled out for all of your references as well. I invite you, again, the link, I'll just share this again. The link for the upcoming speaker series sessions is in the chat. I hope you can join us next week and in the following weeks. And please contact me if you have any questions about Bethesda GIIN or the Innovation Lab. We look forward to hearing from you. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.